Today, I'm going to be speaking with Arick Fudali, who is a civil rights attorney currently representing 11 survivors of Jeffrey Epstein. Arick, great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, David.
So, listen, I have said from the start that in all of these conversations about is Trump in the files or isn't he, and are they doctored or aren't they, and who else is on the list, and how are the vote, the victims have really not been a part of the story. It's been about the political implications. It's been about the political machinations in Congress and what's Pam Bondi up to. But this is a story primarily of victimization. And I wonder if you believe, see, or hope that it's finally now becoming more about the victims.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's well said. The real struggle with the victims, though, is this is nothing new. They've been sort of used as pawns, disregarded, wronged by, administration after administration, Department of Justice after Department of Justice. I mean, dating back literally to the 90s. So unfortunately, while, yeah, I certainly think the victims have sort of been forgotten in this, or at least maybe being used a bit, for political fodder or political gain. It's nothing new. And it's really unfortunate. I do, however, sort of seen a shift, especially, as the people in the House and the congressmen in the House have really sort of advocated for the release of these files. There's been rally after rally, press conference after press conference. There has been some momentum for the victims, and I do feel like in the media, at least from my perspective, they have been giving a bit of a voice, especially more so than they have in the past.
Let me start with a question that I suspect you just may not be able to answer, but if you can't, I would want to know why, which is a lot has been made of. Why don't the victims just say, hey, here's the perpetrators. This is the list. This is who I was victimized by. And
That's a
the
great.
answer that I've been reading and being given is, well, they can get sued and they will get sued. And a lot of these, it would be a re-victimization. It would be outside of what they can afford, et cetera. Is that a valid reason? And can you tell us whether any of the 11 victims you represent have pointed the finger at Trump or anybody else whose names we'd recognize?
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and the short answer is yes, that is it. But I'm happy to explain a little more. I would say, and this actually sort of dates back to the Johnny Depp defamation trial, if you recall that.
Yep.
Following his victory there, I noticed, and I represent victims of sexual abuse, sort of all over the place. I represent accusers of Diddy. I represent accuser of Kanye West. I represent victims against very powerful people, not just Jeffrey Epstein. And the new sort of tool, the new thing, the shiny tool in the tool bag, if you will, for powerful defendants is to sue, is to countersue for defamation, countersue for malicious prosecution. They have enough money in the world that they could pay attorneys for the rest of their lives to just continue to file frivolous lawsuits, nonsense lawsuits against victims. And it's really debilitating. It is really stressful to be sued, especially if you're someone who doesn't have the millions or billions of dollars to pay lawyers to defend you or to pay, the prospect of a judgment against you. So that really is a deterrent. It's also sort of fear. It's not just defamation lawsuits. It's also real fear. Also real fear. Something that's been lost with, I think, in a lot of the coverage of the Epstein is not. It wasn't just the abuse of Epstein. It was the fear he put into his victims. I mean, implied threats and very real threats to them and their families. He would show them pictures of him and Donald Trump and all these other powerful people around the world and would say, you better stay quiet or your family will be in trouble. I mean, he didn't mince words. So they've been truly afraid. I mean, even beyond the grave, I've spoke to some of my clients who still, see him outside their door sometimes, see him outside the window at night and are still, terribly afraid of him, his circle, the type of people that he surrounded himself with, the type of powerful people. You sort of see one things in these emails you see is like how he wielded his power. He would use, I mean, he used his power for gain and to intimidate and to blackmail. And that was no different than how he treated his victims. So I think it's A, yes, fear of defamation, fear of lawsuits, but B, also like true fear for their lives.
Are you willing to say or able to say whether any of the 11 victims you represent, without saying who, have pointed the finger at Trump?
I am willing to say it, and the answer is no. I think another thing that perhaps is underreported is, we keep hearing about this list, and I certainly believe, and I certainly agree, that if do see all the files, we will see people who abused along with Jeffrey Epstein. But I think one thing the public doesn't truly understand, David, is that Epstein primarily trafficked to himself. He was averaging, from my investigation, about three girls a day for decades. I mean, he was a true addict and a true monster. So, you say, well, who is, we hear about this trafficking network, these thousands or so victims, who was he trafficking to? It was primarily himself. I do believe, and we've certainly heard reports and allegations of other high profile individuals who may have abused along with him. But I think it's important to remember that he was really, I mean, primarily trafficking to himself. And then I think he would invite, those in his close circle to join along with him. And of course, we've heard reports of him then using that as gain or political, or blackmail or something along those lines. But I think that's important to remember the wide, the vast array of women he abused himself.
Okay, so the 11 victims you represent have not pointed the finger at Trump.
That's correct.
Based now not on your conversations with your clients, but based on the emails that have been released and the totality of everything that's public, do you have an opinion as to whether, especially what came out in the last 7 days, does suggest involvement from Trump? Or do you believe from what you've seen that it's totally plausible that the answer is no?
I mean, I guess that means that it depends on what you mean by involvement, right? I mean, it is very clear that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were very close friends. They were associates. They partied together. I mean, we have a video of them leering at women and Trump
Yes.
saying, she looks hot. I mean, what? So, if you're asking, involvement, do I believe there's going to be evidence that Donald Trump sexually abused a minor girl? I can't say. I cannot say the answer to that. Certainly, I would say the new emails suggest that their relationship went further than Donald Trump has admitted or has admitted publicly. Clearly, they were very close friends and associated a lot. I mean, there's evidence of him being at the house for a long time, I believe, with a redacted individual who may have been Virginia Giuffre. There's been reports. There's this dog that didn't bark. Certainly, Jeffrey Epstein, it appears from the emails, thought he had something on Trump. There's that email with the journalist where he's talking about like how he could bury Trump. I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing, how he could use this or use that if he does win or if it looks like he's about to win. So, I can say, based on my review of the emails, and again, they need a lot of context, which is why we need the full files. There's certainly something beyond, I think, what Trump has admitted to. How far that goes, I do not know. The other thing I will say is Trump has spent an enormous amount of time, a suspicious amount of time and effort hiding these files.
Right.
This one, I don't really buy this new 180. I think it's just sort of political theater that he can protect himself for whatever which way these votes go. But he has just spent a baffling amount of time and baffling amount of effort and public effort really trying to suppress these files. And I think that leaves everyone, including myself, including the survivors, including most Americans who this is a bipartisan issue, want the files released. It's really sort of baffling, and I would even go as far as say suspicious as to why he has tried so hard to keep these files private.
Let's zoom out a little bit and just talk about representation of victims of sexual assault, et cetera, as you do. There's been this kind of debate in both law enforcement and legal circles over the last, however many years, including through the Me Too movement, of trust the women. And then the counter from some who say, wait, so just like you show up and police or a lawyer like you just accept whatever you're told and you start suing or whatever. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, my approach has always been there is a lot to overcome just to go and make a claim, right? That if you go to police or you go to a lawyer, I think most victims or alleged victims would intuitively know that they are exposing themselves. They're exposing themselves potentially criminally when it comes to false reports. They're exposing themselves to further harassment. They're exposing themselves to to smear campaigns, to not being believed, et cetera. So my approach has been, it's not that you just uncritically accept everything with no inquiry, but it's that you acknowledge that a claim has already passed some minor standard, which is I'm now willing to say this publicly. And then it's a sort of trust but verify. I assume that police and lawyers do ask questions or whatever, but I don't know. I've not been in those rooms, neither with law enforcement nor lawyers. So let me turn it over to you, who's the expert. What level of analysis, vetting, or verification does someone in your position do when someone comes to you with an allegation?
That's a really, really good question. And I'll start with sort of a misconception I think the public has that there is very little in it for a woman to publicly accuse a high profile person of sexual assault or sexual abuse or sex trafficking. If a female or if a victim wanted to just get money from someone, they would threaten a lawsuit and try to get a settlement, right? So I think people think, oh, someone filed a lawsuit. That must mean they're in it for the publicity, they're in it for money. No, there are much better ways to privately get a settlement and get money from the person who, allegedly sexually assaulted you than filing a public lawsuit or going public with it. That's one of the worst ways to make money from it because once you go public, it's out there and there's no
Right.
more leverage in getting a quick settlement. And now you're just going to get the ridicule. The defendant is going to defend and tear apart your personal life and depose your mother and your boyfriend and your ex-boyfriend and your brother and your psychiatrist and your therapy, right? So it is a very unpleasant thing and a very daunting thing for a woman to come forward. So I think that's something that I wish the public learned. Because anytime you hear of one of these public lawsuits, like, oh, she's in it for money. Oh, she's in it for publicity. Oh, she's in it to make a name for herself. It's a terrible way it is a very inefficient and unpleasant way for a woman to get money, a victim to get money. Um, what I do, I mean, every case is different, of course, but there is a very strict, of course, vetting process that we have to go through as lawyers. We put our own reputations on the line, especially a firm like myself, where it's the Bloom firm, especially with us, where we take on such high profile and are very public about our cases and do these interviews. My partner, Lisa Bloom, does as well. We're very out there in the media. We have an even higher level, I think, than most attorneys have to have when they're taking on these cases. So, it's basic vetting. It's interview after interview. I'll do an interview. Another associate will do an interview. My partner, Lisa, will then do another interview. We'll investigate, did you text anyone at the time? We're always looking for sort of, contemporaneous complaints. This something that happened in 2019. Did you tell anyone in 2019? Right? Or you just the first time you're telling someone? Have you been telling a therapist since then? Did you go to the police? Did you confront that? So, speaking to other individuals. So I would say there's no like correct formula that I would say, this is how you vet a potential victim. This is how you vet a case before you file it. It's case by case, but I think the important, thing to take away from it is that you vet it. You have to vet it. Of course, I think what you said, trust and verify. I love that. I think I'm going to start using it. That's a
It is
really
a
good
Reagan
phrase.
thing, just so you
Oh,
know. I don't know how
no,
you feel
never
about using
mind.
Reagan phrases.
Never mind. But it is good. Trust and verify.
Yeah.
Like I trust when a victim comes forward to me. You always have to be cautious because there are, bad eggs. And I think one of the worst things of the Me Too movement was an amazing thing. But I think, you started to see people take advantage, like any movement you're going to see. And I think that led to some, Me Too backlash. And often when I'm in a jury trial, I'm doing voir dire and I'm interviewing the jurors, the first question I always ask is, what are your thoughts on Me Too? And you'd be amazed. I think Me Too is an amazing thing. I think Me Too is all made up. I think Me Too is a bad thing. So, certainly I think when the public or any individual hears about a high profile sexual assault lawsuit, it's going to be met almost 50-50, I would say, no matter what. You look at sort of, my claims against, or my client's claims against Diddy, a lot of backlash. I was at that criminal trial with Sean Combs. I mean,
Hmm.
most of the people in there were staunch Combs supporters, no matter
Yep.
what he did, no matter how many times the video were played of him, just really, I don't know how to, beating beating whatever out of Cassie in the elevator bank. Like, no matter how many times the public sees that video, Diddy supporters are going to continue to support him. So, you deal with, I guess, like another heightened level of adverse opinions when you're dealing with someone who is beloved as a Combs or as a Kanye West or something along those lines.
Last thing I want to ask you about, do you have any opinion as to whether Epstein died by suicide or was murdered by someone who wanted him dead?
Uh, I I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't have any evidence to the contrary that Epstein. But I will say this, and I think this is important when I think it comes down to trusting this administration with Epstein, and I think it's important to take a look back at how much distrust the public should have for this administration when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, first thing you want to look at 2008. Obviously, Trump was not in power in 2008, but in 2008, Alex Acosta gave Jeffrey Epstein what has been often described as a sweetheart deal. I've
Yep.
been calling it an absolute travesty of injustice. He basically had ignored 60 victims allegedly. He even, when he made the deal, he told his fellow prosecutors not to inform the victims. That is an extremely shady thing. I was a prosecutor beginning my career for like 6 months until I found out I had to put like 18-year-olds in jail for marijuana, and I quit. But even in those 6 months, I learned that the one thing you do is you tell the victims what the plea deal is. So you fast forward to 2016, Trump makes Alex Acosta his Secretary of Labor. I actually did the research on this. I think there's only been one other prosecutor in the history of the government who's been made a Secretary of Labor. It was Tom Davis under Obama, and he was actually a civil rights prosecutor, so
Hmm.
it's and worked as a state labor secretary. So it's just such an odd appointment of Alex Acosta, sort of a shamed prosecutor, to become the Secretary of Labor. Then, of course, you move what you just asked me about, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein's put in custody, federal custody. Whether he killed himself or not, something weird happened because he was in federal custody under suicide watch and he killed himself. And again, that is under the Trump administration. It's just such an odd, suspicious, like, what the hell happened there? You move forward to Ghislaine Maxwell under the Biden administration. She's brought to justice, the only person in the history of this Epstein scandal who's been tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. And then what happens within months? Last first year of Trump in power, he moves her to a minimum security resort. So when you look at sort of this history dating all the way back 2008, how Trump has handled Epstein and the scandal, like, you just, I think, have to be suspicious and can't trust any aspect of what's being told to you or what is going to happen.
But you have no specific theory, so to speak.
Yeah, that was a very long way of me telling you I don't have a specific theory other than I don't believe anything that comes out of this administration when it comes
Yeah.
to Epstein. Epstein continues to get special treatment beyond the grave, which is unlike any criminal I've ever seen in my life. He's still treated better than criminals who are alive.
We've been speaking with Arick Fudali, a civil rights attorney who currently represents 11 Epstein survivors. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.